Benchmarks in Guild Wars 2 are not everything. I want to make one thing clear directly here in the intro. The thumbnail is exaggerated. That much is for sure. I just wanted to refer for all the people that know about it to an old meme. This is what it is. I just want to say people overestimate benchmarks. That's what I want to do. And in this video, I want to explain you why. So as always, special shout out to all my dear supporters that help me keep the lights on. And now, without much further ado, let's jump straight in. This is some kind of podcast style video, so just lean back and listen to my rant here about why benchmarks are not as important as people might think, or why they don't understand what benchmarks actually are used for. Let's start with this topic first. What are benchmarks? So if you don't know, in Guild Wars 2, there is a very common way to see how good a specific build is in PvE, how well it does damage. That's the most important part here, is testing it in the Special Forces training area. And in this area, you test on a golem. In an ideal case, just the golem is a standing target, and you get all the boons from a console that you need. You get all the conditions that you need on the golem, and just try how much damage you can deal in the shortest amount of time to test your DPS, the damage per second. That's the idea. And if you then kill a 4 million health golem in a specific time, you can then calculate how much DPS you did per second, or you use Arc DPS for that, or the in-game tool. And that means that in the end, you will get a number. And this number shows how much damage you did to this 4 million golem, or how long it took, so to say. And this DPS number is then comparable. So if you have a ranger that does damage, like a soul beast, and you can compare that to a scrapper and see how much is the number, how high is the number, what does it mean. But you can also look a little bit further and look at the burst damage, for example. Is the burst in the first like 5 to 10 seconds extremely high? And might the target actually die in a real fight before that? But we will get to real fights in a bit later. Or is the consistent damage very similar? So it's like almost always the same. For example, Rival Mech always has almost the same damage, consistently 40k. Doesn't have any bursts or any load times, it's almost always the same. So can you compare that? Yes. Only when you use a benchmark, you can actually get those numbers. Because in real fights, that will be skewed. But now let's talk about what benchmarks are not, because that's way more important actually than what benchmarks are. Benchmarks are not something to say, this number will be reached in a real fight. This is an absolute number. No, this is a number that you can use to compare different builds in an ideal scenario. Because if you use builds and compare them in a real scenario, oftentimes the scenario is changing and you can't really compare it. But benchmarks are used to compare builds and to see what is the absolute highest ceiling of damage that you can get. Only then you can actually compare them. That doesn't take into account how difficult the build is to play. That doesn't take into account how specific the damage profile of a build is, because you just look at the end number after 4 million damage that you dealt. Stuff like that. So it's very important to understand that benchmarks are used to compare. Benchmarks are not used to say this is the number that you need to reach, otherwise you are very bad at this class. This is not the case. Benchmarks should be taken as some kind of guidance how to play this build, what's the optimal rotation, and you should stick to that if you want to deal the most amount of damage. That doesn't mean you should stick to that all the time, because you should adjust it to the situation. You should adjust it to, for example, break bars. You should adjust it if someone goes down and stop and rest them or whatever. This is very important to understand, that benchmarks will not be reached in real fights. We have to take a little bit more into account how real scenarios actually look like and why benchmarks are not reachable there, or why sometimes benchmarks can be very confusing in terms of what the actual number is in real fights, and some builds have a very high number in benchmarks. Before I want to go to why is that, I want to mention here, if you like this video and this debate, be sure to leave a like, and if you want to see more content like this, don't forget to subscribe. But now let's talk about this really big discrepancy between real scenario, real fights, and benchmarks. It's not always the case. There are some fights like Merced Overseer, Raid Boss in Wing 4, that is actually very close to a golem. So there, the benchmark is really reachable, yeah? But in other fights, like, let's say, Kadim 1 or something like that, where you have really a lot of mechanics to deal with, a lot of downtime, a lot of weird mechanics where you kill other foes and stuff, or just generally like fractal fights as well, in open world, whatever, benchmarks are just unreachable, just straight up. Does that mean they are worthless? No, not at all. They are just something that is completely different. The intent of a benchmark is something completely different. So the real scenario is something that can completely change how a build performs. That means that some kinds of builds are really good in a benchmark, really high number, but in a real scenario they can be really lacking. Why is that? Because in some cases you have very specific conditions that you can easily apply in a benchmark in the golem room, but you will probably never or very rarely meet in a real scenario. Good examples would be if you have damage multipliers that are consistent on the boons that you apply to yourself. If you have a really good party with a lot of boons, like, I don't know, for example, a quick heal berserker that provides 11 or a paragon 12 boons to its allies, and you have a 1% per boon damage scaling like Guardian has with virtues, that can be obviously reachable in real scenarios, but it depends on your group. So sometimes you lose damage there. Guardian has another example. You can have 7% damage multiplier while you have Aegis. In some fights that's very easy to upkeep because you never get hit. But if you get hit consistently, you will not be able to upkeep this. So it's something that is not reachable in real scenarios at all. The same goes, of course, for some kind of scholar buff, if you remember that 90% or more health on your health bar, and you get 10% more damage or something like that. That is definitely also not always upkeepable depending on what kind of fight you're in. But that's just the power scaling things. There are other things on top of that, like how many conditions are on the target. Some classes scale with that. Sometimes you have classes that get a lot of damage multipliers in a very short like burst phase. This can be really good in real scenarios, because in real scenarios sometimes the burst phase is very short. And a good example would be, for example, on Demos. There is a damage multiplier that is specific to this boss fight that happens in the first few seconds of the fight if you're in normal mode. And this is extremely high for power damage builds. If you have all the damage multiplier in this short window, you can reach very high damage numbers there that are over the benchmark. So sometimes the real scenario is actually even crazier than the benchmark for a short time. That can be happen. The same goes for fractals, of course. If you have some damage multipliers there as well, and you just burst the boss down in the first 5 seconds or something. This is where the benchmark is telling you just the highest spike possible, and sometimes you even have to alter your rotation because you want to have all the damaging skills at front and not want to have it spread out a little bit, because sometimes the benchmark has a little bit lower, so to say, thought about the longer rotation, because in the long run you might have more damage than if you would put them all together, something like that. But the real scenario is sometimes very different. But this is only talking about some kind of specific on paper things. But there are other things on top of that, because if you have a bad group, the boon uptime might be worse. You don't have quickness for a specific attack and you might cancel it, or you might have to cast it longer. Stuff like that happens as well. But even if everything works well with the boons, there are some mechanics that you need to take care of. The boss phases, you need to go away from the boss. You don't have the damage uptime. So all of that stuff has to be taken into account, and you will not reach the benchmark numbers. So the benchmark numbers are not something that you can say, this is always true. And we have another thing that comes in here. Difficult builds. On the benchmark column, you have definitely different difficulty levels of what kind of builds is very easy to get the highest benchmark numbers and what kind of builds are extremely hard to reach that number. And if that's already the case on the golem, then you can imagine that in a real fight that will be even harder, and the discrepancy between builds that are easy to play and hard to play are even more noticeable. And this is definitely the case if you look, for example, at Rival Mechanist. Quite easy to play, 40k DPS. And if you have a really challenging build, like, I don't know, Condition Mirage, that reaches 50k DPS on the golem, it doesn't mean that you will outperform a Mechanist in a real fight, because in a real fight you will just struggle to get this rotation down because you have to actually move. The boss moves, you have to move. You have specific other things that happen in this fight where you can't get the rotation perfectly down, or you have to concentrate on something else because it's just a fight and not a golem anymore. And Mechanist in that regard is just very easy because you press your buttons and you might still be able to range the damage and you don't care if you have to move. Stuff like that. So there are some discrepancy where builds that have really high benchmarks can be outperformed by builds that have quite low benchmarks, but they are really good on a specific boss, or they are just generally very easy to use. So that's why I think benchmarks are not everything. They are just used to compare. When you want to have a specific build and a high burst damage scaling thing, then you take this build because it has very good burst. Doesn't mean that you will reach exactly this number. It's just something to compare if which build is better in which scenario. And you always have to take every single benchmark with a grain of salt, because even the best of the best will not play this 50k DPS Mirage in every single fight. No, they will take specific damage builds for specific fights because they have other strength on top of that. They are easy to perform on, or they have a lot of utility, a lot of CC, a nice sustain package in there. So oftentimes it's not all about the benchmarks. That's another point that I want to bring up here. That sometimes you take a specific build because it has a really high benchmark, yes. But oftentimes you take another build that has a lower benchmark and has a maybe easier time to perform on a specific boss, but it also brings some kind of reflect. It brings some kind of block, whatever. Sometimes this is way more important to actually succeed in the fight in the long run and help your party to actually not die than just having something that is very aggressive and just very selfish, just does damage, nothing else. and might not even reach that benchmark number because it's way too hard to perform in this fight. And this is why I say it's very important to use those benchmarks correctly, to compare how a specific build can perform. And then you think about what this build does, how easy it is to play, and then you can think about how it is reachable in a real scenario and how this is, so to say, applicable in a real scenario as well. So if you want to know how to reach very high benchmark numbers, be sure to check out my video about how I do my rotation learning process, because I can highly recommend that to you, so that you are not taking the benchmark as the absolute truth or the only thing that matters, but that you understand how to reach a very nice number and get the rotation down, because that's the important part to take away from a benchmark. How the rotation works, how you can actually reach very high damage with the build, that you reach exactly this number, this is not the important part. That's what I want to make clear with this video here. Another disclaimer here, I don't want to say benchmarks are useless, not at all. I think it's very nice that we have people like SC doing those benchmarks, because we need this to actually compare how good the builds are. But you should not take them as the absolute truth. That's the important part. Let me know your takes on this in the comments down below. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, be sure to leave a like and subscribe for more content like this. Thanks again to all my supporters, and thank you all for watching. Hope to see you in the next video.